Hi, I'm Ian Bremer, and welcome to the GZERO World podcast. I'm the host of the weekly show GZERO World on Facebook Watch. In this podcast, we share extended versions of the big interviews from that show. This week, I sit down with New Yorker staff writer and one of the most intriguing voices on politics and foreign affairs, Evan Osnos. You'd be hard-pressed to find another journalist who has so extensively covered political developments here in Washington, throughout China, and most recently, in North Korea. Whether it's from the scrum of a Trump rally in Iowa or the darkened government halls of Pyongyang, Evan has an eerie tendency to be in the heart of things. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
Evan Osnos, staff writer at The New Yorker, runs the foreign policy beat, just got back from North Korea, the People's Republic, and great to be with you, man.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the obvious. They let you in. It wasn't the first time. You had done the Axis of Evil tour back over 10 years ago, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. So, I mean, it must have felt pretty different after 13 years. I guess the first question is a little personal, which is, you freak out a little bit when you're going in there?
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't really know what's going to happen?
I have to say, if you're not really agitated when you're going to North Korea, you're not paying attention. And that's a kind of malpractice as a journalist. So I was, I feel like I've worked in some rough places over the years, and I've never been in a place where I was as tense as I was in North Korea. And I came out at the end of it and had this kind of huge sense of relief. And everybody I know who's done this kind of work has that feeling in North Korea. And I think for a very simple reason, which is that it is utterly outside of your control about how things will go. And that's not always the true. In war zones, sometimes you do have more control. You decide who your driver is. You decide who your interpreter is, all this kind of stuff.
Decide where you're going to go and
you
what you're not
going to do. Go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if something goes wrong, there may be a foreign embassy that can help you. In North Korea, you don't have a way of contacting people very easily. So.
And you had gone over right after the Otto Warmbier coma and death, the young American that was over there. Did that make you feel more comfortable and confident because they wouldn't want that to happen again? Or did it make you feel like really anything could happen?
No, I was very aware of the fact that I didn't want to become part of the problem, in the sense that everybody who I talked to before I went, national security experts, people in government and now outside, people in the intelligence community, had said, we think you can go, just don't make a mistake. Because if you make a mistake, you may find yourself in the center of the negotiation, and you don't want to be part of that story. And so I was really worried that if something went wrong, I was going to be tying the hands of the United States government in terms of how they negotiate with North Korea over their nuclear and weapons program. So I was acutely aware of the fact that the way that they had mistreated Otto Warmbier, the way that he was charged with this crime, was a precedent. And I thought I was going in the front door. I was a journalist. They knew who I was. So the chances of them going out of their way to make an international incident out of me was less likely from my perspective, but you just never know.
Now, you were prepped by the State Department, but it's now the Trump administration. Anything unusual or different about the way they handled you on this trip than the way previous administrations handled you?
Well, what do you mean prepped, in the sense that actually I didn't have any dealings with the State Department before I went?
So who were you talking to?
I was talking to the White House, to the National Security Council.
Okay.
I was talking to some people in the intelligence community.
So that's interesting in and of itself. So how did that go? Anything unusual?
No, that was very much sort of standard operating procedure. I mean, over the years we've gotten used to this kind of, you check in with people who know the region before you go, and you say, is the temperature check okay? The State Department is in a specific predicament at the moment. I mean, I'll tell you, I contacted the State Department for an interview before I went, and they said, we thought about it, we're just going to not do it. And the reason we're not going to do it, and I say this, I have good relationships over there.
Sure.
It's not, I sort of understood their perspective, which was, we're only going to perhaps screw it up if we do that. If we talk to you, or if something we say ends up in print, this might injure this kind of fragile channel that they had going at the moment, which as you know,
may be more fragile. Yeah.
It may be more fragile. Yeah.
On the back of the Trump tweets.
Yeah. I mean, I went and saw the New York channel, as it's known. These are the North Korean diplomats in New York. I saw them again last week. So after I came back from North Korea, and after the tweets about Little Rocket Man.
Right.
And what they said to me was, what do you expect we're going to do here? We are in an impossible position because when your president personally attacks our leader, we have to respond as if that is a message from your head of your government. You know, people are telling us to ignore the tweets. People are telling us they don't matter. But they have to matter. How can we treat them as if they don't?
Kim Jong-un historically was not the one making any of the statements towards the United States. That was always coming from the propaganda arms of the government. Only recently did we see that first statement that came from Kim Jong-un himself. Was that while you were there?
It was after I was there, and it was a big deal. I mean, that's unprecedented for him to put his name, his face to it. He's appearing on, as I saw, on televisions all over the country. I mean, if you're sitting in a restaurant, the TV is always on, and there is more chances than not that it's going to have something about politics. But to turn it on and see Kim Jong-un speaking directly to you, North Korean citizen, and also to the rest of the world, that's a very rare event. And so what that means is that he's staking his personal credibility to it within this very complicated and dangerous political dynamic that he has at home. So I think that...
So he can't back down at this point, your perspective is.
My view is he's locked in.
Yeah, in a way that Trump really isn't.
Trump has mobility. You know, for Trump, this is his choice to make. It didn't have to get to the point, though, where he constrained Kim Jong-un's options. I think that's one of the decisions along the way where Trump has frankly sort of departed from his own national security staff. You know, they had made very clear advice to him over the course of the last 8-9 months. You can say whatever you want on North Korea, but we recommend that you do not personalize this because that's going to limit North Korea's options.
So a nickname, for example, would not be their recommendation.
A Little Rocket Man.
Yeah.
You know, he jumped the guardrails at a certain point, and Trump just went rogue, diplomatically speaking, and decided to do this. And now they're trying to pick up the pieces.
So let's get to North Korea itself, right? So you're there, and one of the things that strikes me as most interesting about North Korea is this idea that you have a completely totalitarian state where every little kid even is on message all the time. But at the same time, you also have more and more contact with the outside world. You know, cell phones that, you know, sort of are picking up South Korean soap operas and the rest. So they clearly have to be more aware of the fact that their regime is not giving them the whole story. Did you have enough exposure to understand what was going on there?
Yeah, this is a remarkable place to visit in 2017 in the sense that this is as close as you will ever get to a true totalitarian state. Yes, there are cell phones, but the cell phones operate only within the country. And the internet that they have is actually an intranet. You know, It doesn't have access to stuff outside.
That's what the Iranians want to set up, actually.
Right, and what the Chinese would love to have.
Yep.
And none of these other countries have ever been able to pull it off. North Korea is operating in the sort of platonic ideal of a totalitarian regime.
Yeah, they're in the cave.
They are.
But are they still just as in the cave?
No, that's the key point. You're absolutely right to raise it. I mean, what's happened over the course of the last 20 years, something big changed in North Korea, which is that after the famine ended in about 1998, they were never able to close off the borders again the way they had before. And so there was all this permeability. And one of the things that began to come in was South Korean movies and television, to the point that now, if you're an elite in Pyongyang, you will sometimes hear fellow elites using a South Korean accent when they speak, which is it's a status symbol. It's an indication of cosmopolitanism, that you are sort of plugged into the outside
Which is
world.
okay?
No.
That's a good thing?
It's not okay.
So how is that allowed in the world's totalitarian state?
Because they are privileged. They are at the top. And they're running a risk. I mean, part of the status symbol is showing that you have the personal confidence and the connections to sort of try that out. But let's be clear, if you are a person out in the countryside, or if you're somebody of low status, or you're somebody without connections in the capital, and you are found with a South Korean movie or television, you can be thrown into the gulag. That's very much the case. So what they're dealing with is a moment now where Kim Jong-un knows that his elites are aware of the outside world. They're aware that this is not the socialist paradise that they were always trained to believe it is.
Right.
And so he has to try to allow them some measure of lifestyle improvement, some measure of normalcy. Let them move money to Switzerland. Let them send their kids to China for college. because otherwise, then he really is at risk.
But, I mean, even when they have that exposure, like we remember Gorbachev and what happened with the East Germans, right? I mean, suddenly you give them a little bit of right to travel, and they're out of there, right?
But,
and that eroded it very quickly.
This is such an interesting question. I totally agree with you. But there's two models. There's the East German model, which ends badly. And then there's the Chinese model,
right,
which means that you can maintain your
there's massive enrichment.
Party. Yeah, because they're co-opted. They're bought in.
Yeah, and you think North Korea's which?
At the moment, it's more like China.
It is, because?
It is. Partly because the level of outside influence is still minimal, even though you're able to get these.
Early stage.
It's early stage. But the other thing is, the North Koreans are not Germans, and they're not stitched into the center of Europe. And they are isolated to a degree that is really profound. And this actually reminds me much more of my experience in Iraq. I mean, I went into Iraq in 2003. I was embedded with U.S. Marines. We came in on the day that the statue fell. And what we discovered was that the country that the United States was now uncorking was a very different country than we thought it was, and was in many ways much more warped and damaged than we ever understood it to be. And I think in North Korea there's something similar, that even if the Kim regime goes, and that may happen someday, we are going to find ourselves confronting a country that has been truly traumatized by 70 years of this kind of treatment. And East Germany was in a slightly different situation. And I think that we have to be thinking more in the Iraq model.
Well, and East Germany hasn't really worked very well. As you see with the elections we just had in Germany, I mean, half of East Germans are saying they don't feel like Germany ever really got unified for them. Right?
Yeah.
So imagine what that percentage would be of North Koreans in a unified Korean peninsula. Right?
Well, if you think about it, South Korea's economy today is roughly 60 times the size of North Korea's economy. The idea of putting these things together is going to be... it would be an epic task, and it would be one that would require a lot of the United States, require a lot of China.
And the South Koreans have no reality about this whatsoever as a government.
They live in a very strange place. On the one hand, they have to go about their daily lives, so they can't think about the fact that they've got Kim Jong-un 30 miles over the border. On the other hand, I think there's something of a myth that they are living a delusion. They know the risks. And as much as this has damaged the North Korean populace living under Kim Jong-un, the division of the peninsula has had a profound effect on South Korean politics, too. It's one of the reasons why we see so much sort of turbulence and drama and simple weirdness in Korean politics.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your impressions when you were there, right? What surprised you, given the way it's being covered around the world when you actually got it and experienced it? I mean, one is obviously the economy is doing better than most people understand.
Right.
How did that become obvious and evident to you, but also just general sort of unusual impressions?
Well, one of the things is surprising that North Korea, for all of the sanctions against it, for all the deprivation and isolation, it is actually a country that is in the capital growing. You see new buildings going up. There are new cars on the road.
The metro system is being
built.
The
metro system is working. There are black limousines honking at you and sort of threatening to run you over, as there are in other authoritarian countries, which is faintly sort of reassuring, because the absence of cars would be another thing. And I think this is important to mention, that if you follow North Korea closely and you read a lot about it these days, you read a lot about this kind of economic growth. And I think some of that has gone too far in the analysis. The reality is, it is a more isolated and impoverished place than we sometimes remember. I mean, this is still a country that has a GDP per capita that is on the level of Haiti. It is poorer than Yemen. So, when we talk about it having economic growth and that giving Kim Jong-un options and so on, I think we have to make sure we keep that in perspective. And that actually surprised me. I'd spent so much time among smart analysts of North Korea thinking about the way in which economic reform was happening that I'd gone too far in imagining that this was like China in about 1976, and it's not. It's China at most in about 1968, in the depths of the Cultural Revolution, when the dominant experience that anybody has on a given day is political and ideological, and the fear of being ratted out by your neighbor.
Yeah. A little bit of economic improvement goes a long way, though, in that environment, right? I mean, we don't have the stories of them eating tree bark anymore.
No, I mean, there is still 70% of the population receives some sort of food assistance, but there is this tremendous gap between the rich and the poor, which is really taken off. And some of the most interesting conversations I had were with North Koreans outside of North Korea. So in South Korea, I spent a lot of time with defectors, and one of the things they told me was that these days, the status symbol you want, if you're super rich in Pyongyang, is a piano. And they said it doesn't matter if you can play it. If you have a new Yamaha piano, $22,000 to get a new one, $8,000 to get a used one, that's a signal to your other fellow elites that you are playing at a certain kind of level. a lot of this development that you see in North Korea today, sometimes some of the big buildings in the capital, for instance, are being built with private money. It's a strange setup where basically if you're an elite that's made some money from corruption or through the black market or through the official economy, you're expected to then donate that money, quite literally donate it back into the government so that they can then build these big marquee projects. So they are really stitched into this government. And I think it's one of the reasons why we should not be expecting North Korean elites to rise up tomorrow and overthrow this leader despite the mismanagement of
And things go badly in Russia economically. They squeeze the oligarchs and make them put that cash into the system. In North Korea, you expect that's going to be a hell of a lot more severe, given the challenges they have. So when you talk to the North Koreans, you did both the politicos and not. How much anger towards an American? How concerning the idea of them getting blown up? Because it's all escalating. I mean, did you get any sense of these guys understand the level of peril that their leaders potentially playing with, or are they just not?
Yeah, I think in many ways the most telling moment of my visit to North Korea was a very quiet moment. It was over lunch, where I was sitting with my minder, who's an analyst at the North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Smart guy.
Yeah. Just that one, or there were other folks there?
There were always other folks in the background.
So they haven't changed that,
No.
Okay.
But in this case, we're having an honest conversation. I mean, one of the things I was told before going to North Korea by friends who spent a lot of time working on it, analyzing it, they said, if they offer you a drink, say yes. And I said, why? And they said, because it makes them more comfortable. They're more likely to talk. So strangely enough, when you're writing about North Korea, you end up drinking a fair amount. So here we are at lunch, having a North Korean beer, and we're watching on television as Kim Jong-un comes on the screen and says that he might rain terror down upon the United States. I'm paraphrasing here, but it was a version of the same idea that we've heard over and over. And I turned to my counterpart, this guy named Park Sung-il, who's 35 years old, has a 5-year-old son, speaks perfect English. I mean, it's sort of a plugged-in guy. And I said, give me a break. Do you honestly imagine, that you could have a nuclear exchange with the United States that would not be a cataclysm for you and for the rest of the world? And he said, yes. We have suffered terribly in our history. We've survived the Korean War. We survived the famine. And we would survive this too. Not everyone, he said, but some. And that is a chilling message to get from somebody who is not a lunatic. This is not a jihadist in a cave who is muttering about martyrdom. This is a man who works for the government, who is as plugged in as anybody in North Korea, has access to the internet, and is telling me as lucidly as possible that he really believes that the North Korean self-narrative is such that if necessary, they would survive an encounter with the United States.
Well, certainly the willingness of the North Koreans to take pain is a hell of a lot greater than the average person in the developed world.
And it's really part of their self-image, which is sometimes we overlook from afar. But, they take pride in the fact that they were eating bark in the 90s and lived through it. They take pride in the fact that they've been an enemy of the United States for 70 years and have not succumbed.
So the sanctions that are being hit by them right now, including by China, are something that also makes them feel stronger, we can overcome?
I think the sanctions, they're part of the sense of encirclement, and that does feed the domestic narrative, so it's useful for them politically. But I also think the sanctions are having more bite now than we really anticipated. There was an argument, if we'd had this conversation 2 years ago, everybody in the business would have said sanctions are not having an effect. Now they're not saying that. What they're saying is that some of the sanctions, particularly secondary sanctions on Chinese companies and banks, are beginning to have an impact. So what that means is that we should give them some time, as much as we can.
Trump seems to be willing to do from his latest statements.
Except when he tweets out something like, there is only one way here, implying that it's military.
And yet, at the same time, just in the last 24 hours, we see Trump talking about the fact that actually what the Chinese have been doing is more than they have historically. It's been successful. Let's not talk about hitting the Chinese harder. They're doing more, right? That's been a win for Trump. So undermining Tillerson in terms of direct diplomacy, but using the Chinese in terms of the squeeze, he's never said that you have to only go military for the squeeze. He's liked the sanctions option.
I think there is, in a sense, he has at moments taken the right approach. At certain moments. The problem is that when there is so much manufactured chaos at the top of the American government that is undermining the Secretary of State's ability to operate, the message that's received in Pyongyang is not, wow, this is carefully calibrated ambiguity of the kind that has defined nuclear brinkmanship since 1945.
Right.
It's that they are confused and that they are sending mixed messages. That's the part where I feel like it's missing an opportunity. The U.S. doesn't need to send a confusing message. It can send whatever message it wants. But right now, we're sending essentially a sort of muddled signal to
But the sanctions so far, again, largely on the back of Chinese implementation and escalation, you think are biting.
I think they are biting.
And, but you don't think they're having any constructive impact on North Korean behavior so far.
I don't think we know yet, to be perfectly honest. I mean, I think they're very good at hiding the stitches. We don't know, in fact, how much is this affecting industrial activity. We don't know whether, in fact, there is a gas shortage for cars. The U.S. has gotten ahead of itself a couple times and said that there is, and that's not been confirmed. I think what we know is that we know where this is headed, in a sense. And I shouldn't overstate that. Nobody really knows where this is headed. It could end in miscalculation and it could end in conflict. But I don't fundamentally believe the North Koreans are pursuing an active military confrontation with the United States, and I don't believe the United States is either.
Right.
But I do think that we are dealing with leaders on both sides who are so inexperienced and are so overconfident that it's the recipe for a disaster.
And when you put China in there, now, those that don't know, I mean, you were the China correspondent for the New Yorker for a number of years, where you and I started to get to know each other pretty well. How do you think the Chinese perceive their role in U.S. versus North Korea? We know that it's their backyard. They don't want it to blow up. They're trying to be the adult in the room. But they've also been escalating recently in degrees that they would not have historically, a lot further than I think people in the Obama administration thought that they would.
Yeah.
How urgent do the Chinese see this? How is this really top priority for them, or do they take on the logic you just gave, which is fundamentally we know as long as we manage it okay, neither side really wants military confrontation, and we'll get through this?
China fundamentally is trying to balance two threats as far as they perceive it. One threat is North Korea, and one threat is President Trump. We can't forget, and they certainly never forget, that the backdrop against which the North Korea drama is playing out is that China feels a fundamental strategic anxiety about its relationship to the United States, and that is their main event. So whatever they do is going to be contained within the parameters of how they think their future relationship with the United States is going to be apportioned. Who's going to have power over what parts of the Asia Pacific? Who is going to have control? Who is going to do this? China is doing what it thinks it needs to do right now to keep President Trump on side. And to prevent the crisis with North Korea from boiling over. In many ways, Chinese leaders don't trust Kim Jong-un, but I think they trust Donald Trump even less, because they recognize that the Trump administration does have this fundamental tension with China about trade, about strategy in the world. And so for that reason, they are always holding back slightly. I mean, because look, the key thing that the United States wants China to do is to cut off oil exports to North Korea. Until and unless that moment happens, China is not actually doing everything the United States wants.
They're not doing everything they could, certainly.
Right.
Well, you can make that argument. But I mean, from the Chinese perspective, that has to be seen as potentially enormously dangerous for their own interests in their own backyard. I have to assume people around President Trump also know that.
They know that. They're pushing for it. I mean, they are pushing China to do it. That's what they believe that's the decisive move. If they can do that, then North Korea might, in fact, be brought to heel. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that China is ever prepared to do that. They've tested it. They've done it briefly a few years ago just to see what would happen. At one point in my reporting on North Korea, I came upon an interesting fact about the U.S.-China relationship, which is that Xi Jinping has said in private to both President Trump and President Obama before that his most important priority as it regards North Korea is no war, no chaos, no nukes. And as a U.S. official said to me, when we hear that, we always come away saying, great, no nukes, we all agree. But actually the answer, of course, is that his dominant priority is maintaining the status quo in East Asia, because that status quo has been so beneficial to China.
And that status quo includes nukes.
That status quo may, in fact, include nukes, and that's much more important to North Korea. Sorry, it's much more important to China than it is to satisfy America's demand.
No, the point is that status quo, as of right now, that status quo includes nukes.
Oh, yeah.
And the Chinese have been living with that for quite some time. And the Americans, apparently only now that it can hit the U.S., are we starting to be a little bit more concerned.
Well, the question is, would China throw its weight, would it invest in this hard problem of trying to get North Korea to give up nuclear weapons? And the answer is probably not. They don't believe that that's necessary, and they're not willing to expend the capital.
Didn't you find it interesting when the Chinese government said, okay, if any escalation, any hostilities are started by the North Korea, we're on the American side, but if they're started by the U.S., we're actually not, right? That struck me as a very different perspective of what we've heard from the Chinese recently.
Yeah, there has been a shift in the Chinese establishment over the last, I'd say, 5 or 10 years. I mean, I remember a few years ago when a very good Chinese, very well-connected foreign policy analyst named Deng Yuan published a piece that introduced the idea that China should part ways with North Korea, and he lost his job for it. It was so taboo at that point. Today, you can say that. You can say it, you can publish it, you can give it in a speech. So that represents a significant shift. I mean, it's easy to forget, but under Chairman Mao, the relationship between North Korea and China was so intimate, it was so intertwined. Chairman Mao used to call it as close as lips and teeth. It is not that way anymore. Kim Jong-un has never met Xi Jinping. He's never even received the Chinese ambassador in Pyongyang.
And he's not been to China
He's never been to China as far as we know. There was rumors of one trip. It's not been confirmed. The reality is there's a tremendous amount of hostility. If you ask North Koreans how China treats you today, they will use a very vivid expression, which is they say that China treats us like the dirt between their toes, which is a long way between lips and teeth.
Well, I mean, it's as close as lips and teeth. I mean,
right.
From that perspective.
I suppose viewed another way. That's a generous framing.
There you go. So let's before we close, let's talk a little bit about our favorite president, because you wrote this big piece, and it was a couple months before the election, about when pretty much everyone in the media elite was saying he's not going to win. You said, let's really look at what a Trump administration would mean, assuming that he actually gets the presidency. So a year after you've written that piece, looking back on it, how good do you feel about where it's played out? What's different? What's different? Start with what's different, since we know you're brilliant.
So that piece was called Trump's First Term, and we said a few things would likely happen. He would, for instance, try to undermine the Paris Peace Accord.
Okay, that's not different.
He would try to kill the Obama-era Clean Power Plan.
Also not different.
So
you're just not playing, right? Okay, I'm gonna try again.
I know. I have to actually. I'm trying to think
different?
it through. I'm trying to think it through.
What surprised you? Again, that's what's most interesting, because you spent so much time thinking about this. Now he's in a year in. What has surprised you about Trump?
I hate to say it, Ian, because it sounds like totally smug, but like, in that piece, people said to me, here's the things we worry about. He's going to use Twitter as a tool of statecraft. He's going to react in national security crises in ways that are going to be unhelpful. He's going to antagonize and create chaos within his senior leadership, which is going to bog down the government. In many ways, a lot of those things have turned out to be true. He hasn't launched a nuclear weapon yet. And we did say that might happen. Yeah. So in that sense,
fun. But okay, let me push back.
I have to really.
It's funny,
I haven't thought about that piece
saying that he's using Twitter as statecraft, right? Yeah. I mean, he's certainly using it to rile up his base. But so I just saw Ross Douthat from New York Times, who on the back of Trump's launching another fusillade against sort of NBC and saying maybe they should have their license taken away, and he's going, oh my God, like in 2019 he's going to be saying that we should suspend the Constitution and have no more elections. He should be dictator, and no one's going to pay attention to him. I'm like, dude, no. You guys are going to be writing about it and going, oh my God, all day long. And meanwhile, it's not going to be policy. So, I mean, I could easily argue that Trump is not using Twitter in any way as an instrument of statecraft, but rather he's using it as an instrument of domestic politics, which, by the way, he's reasonably effective at. How do you push back against that?
I would say if you look around at places like Mexico, with whom we had a deep and abiding bond until November 8th, 2016, the way that he has treated that country over the course of the last 9 months in office has fundamentally altered the chemistry of Mexican politics in a way that is not helpful to American national security. So, there's just no question that when he does the things he does, it undermines Rex Tillerson. When he says, Rex, you're wasting your time, when he makes it known via his Twitter account that this man might be out of a job, if you're the foreign minister of a country, the kinds of people you meet with all the time, Ian, how do you make a choice to invest in a guy like Rex Tillerson? Because you don't have any real belief that he's going to be there.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is as counterproductive as I expected it to be. I think the thing that has surprised me is the degree of ideological incoherence in this administration. There was an expectation among his economic advisors that he would be able to achieve tax reform, that he was going to use it in reconciliation, which is a sort of efficient way of getting something through the Congress. And they weren't able to do that. They weren't able to get to repeal and replace. So that has been a surprise. I would have assumed that he would have grafted his mission, his movement, onto the pre-existing Republican establishment that would have allowed him to accomplish things in government. He's proved to be actually incapable of reining in his own impulses enough to be able to achieve the things
Now,
he needs
is
to
that
survive.
ideological incoherence that surprises you, or just the lack of political capacity to work with Congress? Because, I mean, it's hard to imagine when Trump came in that you thought he was really ideologically coherent, right?
No, but I thought that those two are related in the sense that I think the fact that he doesn't know what he stands for means he doesn't know who he trusts and he doesn't know who to work with. And as a result, he just kind of careens around from one hostile encounter to the next. And that makes it very hard to get anything done. If you look at his own relationship with Republicans in Congress right now, has there been a greater act of political self-sabotage in the 21st century? I can't think of one. I mean, he has just truly gone out of his way to antagonize the people who he needs on side. And as a result, he's sort of paralyzed politically.
What's impressed you the most with the first year so far of the Trump administration? What do you think that they've done the best that you wouldn't have expected?
Pregnant pause.
No, you got to be able to do this.
Let me think. And this is not theatrical. Like, I
No.
am truly...
I understand.
Like, you are talking to somebody who is having a hard time taking an issue that I think that they have done well.
I mean, I'd argue this is part of the problem, right?
That members of the... So go ahead.
mean,
I would
no,
actually let me turn the question
one of
around.
the brightest guys
Let me turn the
out
question
there
around
writing
on
on
you.
this
Let me turn the
stuff.
question around. I mean, I think in fairness, genuinely,
What?
name something that you think they've done really well in the first year.
Well, look, I certainly think the access that the business community has had to the Trump administration is vastly greater. You talk to an average CEO, they feel so much better with Jared and Chris Liddell and that entire constellation than they did with Valerie Jarrett and with Obama, leaving aside maybe just the core Silicon Valley companies. That would be one obvious one.
But what about the Steve Schwarzman council that had to be disbanded?
Yeah, but that was a council. I mean, yeah, he made statements about Charlottesville, so the council had to go away. But their actual, again, if you get rid of the theatrics in the New York Times and on CNN every day and talk about the way people are actually discussing
But
it.
it's not theatrics when you have a president who is, in effect, enabling and emboldening the work of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. That's not theatrical. That's core to America's ability to function
There's
as a
no
republic.
question that Trump's willingness to use identity politics and race to advance his supporters and distract from other issues has had effects which are negative and corrosive of American institutions and values. I accept that. But that wasn't the question. The question that I asked you and then you refused to answer because you couldn't think of something and said that to me was, what's he done well? Here's something he's done well. Again, you talk to those CEOs. You go around and they will actually tell you. I mean, I would say that the U.S.-India relationship is probably warmer today than it was under Obama. The U.S.-Japan relationship is warmer today than it was under Obama. Certainly the U.S.-Saudi relationship.
So I'll give you
that.
one. I'll give you one.
So that's why I'm asking, and I know that you have these things, but I'm pushing you because, again, I think that if you don't have that answer ready, even though
I'll tell you why. So one, I think access for the business community to the White House is something that exists under every White House, and to a degree, it's better under this one, which should not come as anybody's shock. That should not be a big surprise. I don't necessarily regard that as a fundamental contribution to America's future security and economic growth. That was going to happen
but
anyway.
It's simply something he's done well. Right?
But if you put that on the ledger opposite the things that have gone off the rails in terms of America's standing around the world, the inability to get anything through Congress, I mean, the fact that we haven't had any major legislation over the course of the last year is a profound fact. But I'll take your point. And I actually, I mean, one example that I think sometimes does get overlooked is that I think he has shaken up the relationship with China. He has forced China to recognize that the United States was not going to go along quietly in essentially permitting China to gradually grow its sphere of influence around Asia, to essentially quietly reestablish or establish control over the South China Sea and the East China Sea. China is off balance at the moment. The problem is that they've also come to believe that he's a paper tiger and that he can be rolled, that his simple lack of information and the incoherence of the leadership around him makes it easy for them to achieve their aims. So on the one hand, yes, they have done a good job in putting China on notice, but they haven't been able to follow through.
Well, backhanded compliment is better than none. Evan Osnos, a pleasure to be with you. We will be talking soon.
I enjoyed it. Thanks, Ian.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.